So welcome to the second panel of the workshop, The Cultural Politics of Trust. We will have three panelists. This panel, the first one would be Gonzalo Marcelo from the University of Coimbra. His presentation is titled Recognition, Suspicion, and Critique toward a Restorative Hermeneutics of Trust. And Gonzalo will first address some epistemological issues of trust and try to find some kind of solution in Ricoeur's concept of restorative hermeneutics. And hopefully we'll have a second presentation by David Hernández de la Fuente, a philologist and writer from Madrid, with a presentation titled Modern Culture of Legality and the Classical World Between Constitutional Patriotism and the State of Exception. And David will connect some issues from Athenian democracy and the Republican Rome with some contemporary issues, particularly addressing Carl Schmitt and Agamben's theory. And the last presentation for today is by Lydia Tienda Palop, Trust and Deception, the Ethical Dilemma in Contemporary Military. And Lydia will challenge the line between trust and deception by addressing some paradoxes in today's understanding of the institution of army forces. So Gonzalo, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Igor, for your presentation. So I'll just share my screen. Just give me 1 second. You can see it, right? Okay. So first of all, let me thank the conference conveners, Adriana and Nuria, and also thank you, Nuria, for inviting me and having me. It's for me a great pleasure to be with you today, and I already learned a lot from the first panel, which was really great. Let me also just very briefly introduce myself and explain the nature of this work, of this presentation. So I'm a social and political philosopher based in Portugal. And I have a background both in hermeneutics and in critical theory, a background and an interest. I'm not really a specialist in trust either, and neither is this a finished paper. Rather, it's more like part of a series of papers. This will be the third one, if all goes well, for a project, a personal project, which I would like to turn into a project for an ERC, an European Research Council project dealing with the relation, if any, between rationality and ideology, let's say. Also, and as a word of introduction, maybe just a very small, brief explanation on why I am using hermeneutics into this project. Because sometimes some of my colleagues from social political philosophy or critical theory are a little surprised why I am using hermeneutics, which is, you know, this old-fashioned type of philosophy linked with Heidegger, etc. Basically, what I'm doing is taking hermeneutics as a method applied to social analysis, much in the vein of, you know, Charles Taylor, Ricoeur, also to some extent Axel Honneth. And so basically understanding as interpretation, as an interpretive paradigm, which has a very specific view of rationality and which is very far from, you know, decision theory, game theory, because it views rationality as being embodied, intrinsically intersubjective and dialogic. And so there's a lot of presuppositions to the hermeneutic method. One of them is the attempt to find a deep understanding and interpretation of social phenomena, and not reducing rationality to to scientific rationality, and so taking a first-person perspective, etc. So all this just to, as a way of introduction, to maybe make a little bit clearer from the start what I am attempting to do. And so now officially starting, recognition, suspicion, and critique towards restorative hermeneutics of trust. So very simple, even banal starting point with a few observations, a few notes on trust and recognition. I would start by saying, from a non-expert, let's say, point of view, that trust is something like a prerequisite of the social bond. Because without trust, political communities simply do not hold together. And so at the second level, we can say that trust rests on implicit or explicit recognition processes at several levels. I guess that first we might say that successful intersubjective agency unfolds in different spheres of recognition. You are all certainly very well acquainted with the neo-Hegelian attempts to explain social reproduction and socialization through the spheres, through the different spheres of recognition. There are many such accounts. I think I have been mainly influenced by Honnett's account, both in the struggle of recognition and also in the latest book on the democratic institutions and the institutions of recognition. And I mean, we can reconstruct these different spheres differently. We can talk about the spheres of love, of rights and esteem, and also the ways in which social freedom, as Honneth calls it, comes to be realized in some very specific institutions tied to the future of modernity. I don't want to delve too deep into this discussion, but I would say that at the deep intersubjective level, intersubjective agency and also trust do depend on relations of recognition. Now, if we look at a very specific dimension of trust, which is epistemic trust, that has to do with the way we acquire knowledge and the degree of certainty we attribute to the knowledge we acquire, I think we can say that epistemic trust ultimately relies both on intersubjective trust, that is trusting in each other's word, trusting on testimonies, to put it in other words, and also on trust in institutions. Here, I am not making a specific conceptual difference between trust and confidence, for instance, as was done in the first panel. I am just speaking about intersubjective trust and institutional trust. I guess that's one way of putting it. I think we can also say as a starting point that ultimately what is at stake at trust is trust in language. That is, when we speak about trust in each other's words, and when we speak of trust as being constitutive of the social bond, what is ultimately at stake is language as a necessary condition for human action. Here I'm quoting Ricoeur from Memory, History, Forgetting, when he says, "The credit granted to the word of others makes the social world a shared intersubjective world." In other words, if my first attitude towards the social world around me is one of suspicion and not of trust as a starting point, this means not only that intersubjectivity and human action in concert, in collaboration, is hindered, but also ultimately that in processes of deep polarization in which there are very scarce shared beliefs, let's say, it is the perception of a world that is intersubjectively perceived, let's say, that might also be menaced. And this is very problematic, of course, in social terms. And so a deep problem we have to confront is the following. When institutions or individuals are systematically, and let's say sometimes automatically mistrusted, this shared world is lost. And this is the reason why ultimately the social bond is at stake. So this has obviously a moral or ethical dimension to it, because it brings about specific epistemic injustices, as you all know, Miranda Fricker has been talking about ever since her pioneering book on epistemic injustices from 2007, such as when one suffers from testimonial injustice due to a certain identity trait, when police won't trust the words of women who have been victims of sexual abuse because they are deemed hysterical, and so on and so forth, or when they won't believe the words of a Black man going around in a suburb of America, precisely because he's being Black. And what can also be at stake are issues of hermeneutical injustice, when basically we don't have the words to describe the concepts of what has been happening in our experience. And so we are deprived from the acquisition of knowledge to really put into words and to describe what has already been perceived subjectively, let's say. And so at which point are we now, sorry for this, in terms of our public sphere and our political situation? Something has already been said in the first panel, and so I guess my presentation will tie well with the discussion that we had at the end of the panel. I would say that, well, on the one hand, sometimes the loss of the shared world is caused by political or other ideological reasons. And here, just also a parenthesis, conceptual clarification, let's say. I am using ideology, as you will see, in a very specific sense, which has as its quintessential example, let's say, political ideologies, but is not, my mind, reduced to political ideologies. So an ideology will be, or pathological ideology will be, every totalizing system of beliefs. And so we have political ideologies, but we can also speak about, I don't know, scientific ideologies or cultural ideologies. And so I would treat conspiracy theories, for instance, as instances of ideologies. But I'll go into that in a moment. And so, in deeply polarized political scenarios, the public sphere becomes fractured and communication is hindered. This is also a very banal remark, but she who does not think alike, who does not think like me, is seen as an ideological other, and is often the target of extreme suspicion. And this is today the case with the multiplication of conspiracy theories and a phenomenon that can be described as ideological blindness. I'll try to unpack this a little bit as we move forward. I'm not naming any conspiracy theory specifically in this slide, but you all know what I am talking about. You can think about COVID-19 or vaccine negationists, COVID-19 deniers, QAnon in the US, for instance. So, coming back to the notion of ideology and choosing to speak about so-called pathological ideologies, I am building a little bit on some remarks by Paul Ricoeur in his lectures on ideology and utopia. Contrary to much political analysis, actually Ricoeur doesn't believe that every ideology is inherently a source of deceit, of illusions. He chooses to speak of ideology and utopia as two forms of the social imaginary. Social imaginary defined more or less like Castoriadis also does it. And each of these forms, ideology and utopia, has for Ricoeur constitutive and pathological forms. So ideology provides a legitimating function in its constitutive form. And this is actually useful to understand every explanation of social behavior that basically speaks about the motivation behind actions. And so it is close to the explanations of the spirit of capitalism in neo-Weberian approaches. For instance, when Luc Boltanski and Eve Chiapello speak of the new spirit of capitalism. And so this legitimating function, as defined by Ricoeur, is that of adding a surplus value of belief in the authorities' claims. And so basically ideology is there to justify beliefs, let's say. And so ideologies become pathological when they conceal the contingency of human action and admit of no alternatives. And so you could think of, for instance, neoliberalism and its naturalization of the explanation of action in terms of human nature and all the Tienda discourses, etc., might be very clear cases of pathological ideologies defined in this sense as it is advanced by Ricoeur. So I am building a little bit on his definition of ideology, and specifically as of pathological ideologies. And I am trying to make sense. This is not very original, of course, but I am trying to make sense of a notion of ideology that is able to grasp a little bit the phenomena of illusion, of spread false beliefs, etc., that we can find in our fractured public sphere of today. And so this is, again, a working definition, but I'm trying to look at it as an intrinsically social totalizing system of beliefs. This means that for those who hold that specific ideology, all meaningful experience is seen through that same perspective. And so in a way, it kind of admits of no alternative. Then I tried to more or less uncover a theory of beliefs behind it, because I think in a given ideology, we have core beliefs, and then we have other beliefs that depend on these core beliefs. And this can actually be formed without proper verification. That is that they can be based on things like fake news, propaganda, etc. And these core beliefs can become very strong and very hard to revise. And they can actually have a contaminating effect on other beliefs. And so, for instance, if I believe that all progressives are evil, and I'm a Trump voter in the United States, and someone tells me that I don't know, Hillary Clinton is actually a pedophile, I can be fed with all sorts of evidence telling me that this is a false belief, and I probably won't buy it. I won't believe that it is a false belief because I will pin it on the ideological other. This is all the fake news of the progressive media that is trying to hide something from me, etc. And so ideologies and their core beliefs can be so strong as to lead us to deny evidence that would prove it wrong. And so in certain cases, an ideology can be virtually immune to counter evidence, to facts and reasons. And this is obviously a problem we have to tackle. And so regardless of its sometimes unfounded claims, an ideology can come to coordinate the actions and beliefs of whole collectives, of groups of people. And people under the spell of pathological ideologies can actually thus be both victims and perpetrators of what I propose to call an hermeneutical delusion. because they are victims of it, because they are somehow deluded. They somehow fall victim in the first instance to that false belief, the false ideology, the pathological ideology, let's say. But insofar as there is confirmation bias and all that sort of stuff, insofar as within that specific ideology, new beliefs, no matter how false they might be, can come to confirm what I often wrongly already believe about certain facts, certain political facts, etc. People just automatically tend to perpetrate them and to enter into the wheel of, you know, spreading fake news and stuff like that. And so in these cases in which I speak of hermeneutical delusion, misguided interpretations can systematically lead to false beliefs and new false beliefs that are resistant to division, to revision. And today, the dissemination of this phenomenon is widespread. It has to do with, you know, digital bubbles and social media and all that stuff we all heard about and we've all seen. And so this poses a very serious threat to the cohesion of the social fabric. In the paper, I'll probably argue that this can be seen as a social pathology of reason in honest sense, insofar as it is an impediment to a social evolution towards a higher standard of rationality, but I won't go into this in detail right now. I'll just, in the last part of my paper, I know I'm reaching my time, but if I can have just a very few minutes just to conclude, we can just ask, how can this complex set of problems be tackled? So my hypothesis is to approach it through a hermeneutic lens in order first to try to grasp its deep social causes and the motives guiding these social actors, and then to develop strategies to foster recognition processes and trust, arguing that these two are closely tied together. And so I'll try to deal with these conclusions relatively fast so as to not to delay the panel. And so how do we address the problem? I'd say that several different angles or dimensions are at stake here. The first one is not properly hermeneutic, but it is tied with the hermeneutic aspect. So I would say that to tackle this, we need, for lack of better term, I am calling it a structural objective analysis of how social and economic asymmetries impact on epistemic asymmetries. So for instance, how does access to education, formal education or lack thereof, impact epistemic trust on institutions and in many places on institutions and on expertise also, for instance. And in many indicators seem to show us that in many contexts, people who suffer from inequality, from economic inequality and also inequality to formal, in the access to formal education, etc., tend to mistrust more the word of experts, etc., who are then identified as I would call ideological others, tend to think they are being brainwashed, etc. The second angle is, of course, ideology critique. This is also what I'm proposing to do. And in this dimension, we must ask, for instance, how are the phenomena of hermeneutical delusion related to different ideologies? Let's say, are certain political ideologies more prone to conspiracy theories and why? And this is actually the case. You can see that, for instance, in the United States, there is a high level of Trump supporters that believe in QAnon, and so that all their opponents are pedophiles and stuff like that. The hermeneutic standpoint comes in with what we could describe as a hermeneutic reconstruction from the standpoint of agents themselves. And I think this is important because very often we tend to look at this problem from an external viewpoint And so it's kind of what was being said in the first panel about dealing with this by feeding more information. And when we try to discuss this from the point of view of an external critique, let's say, we tend to fall back into paternalist schemes. And I think that also has to be somewhat avoided. And so we really have to ask, why do people cling to these ideologies? And which problems and claims do they intend to address? For instance, are COVID-19 or vaccine negationists also addressing a democratic problem caused by an epistocratic turn? This was also already a bit discussed in the first panel. And I believe they are, but this is a different problem. So this entails really analyzing the extent to which some of their claims might be deemed rational, while other claims won't. And so they might just be considered widely delusional. I'll conclude just by saying that critique plays a role here, but so does dialogue and hermeneutic understanding. Because actually conspiracy theorists and other fringe groups and movements often believe they are exerting social critique. And so we actually need to really understand them. And so understanding them and lowering the levels of political polarization without eliminating conflict as an intrinsic political logic in order to reconstruct the social bond also involves an exercise, I would say, and this is just a suggestion, of difficult dialogue, even with those who might at first refuse to listen. And so what I am calling a restorative hermeneutics of trust is basically just saying that on the one hand, intersubjective trust and trust in institutions are deeply interwoven, because on the one hand, a deeply polarized public sphere without intersubjective trust will always suspect that institutions are captured by ideological others, while on the other hand, unjust, reified, or failing institutions that do not meet the legitimate democratic claims of its citizens will also generate mistrust of power in other people. And the restorative hermeneutics of trust, this is really the end, would involve a hermeneutic process of restoring trust at both levels. On the one hand, recognizing the motives of suspicion that might actually be sound at the institutional level. And here we are dealing with the democratic flaws of the democracies we already have. Its crisis of legitimacy, for instance, in the European Union, that became very blatant after the debt crisis, and finding in these sound motives of suspicion, the normative basis pushing for institutional reform so that we have better and more just institutions. And understanding the objective causes and motives also from the first person perspective that fuel exacerbated suspicion, and trying to engage a dialogue, even though albeit a difficult dialogue, aiming at going beyond the hermeneutic delusion, and so trying to somehow help these people escape the bubbles they have been put into. Sorry, this was really very, very fast at the end. It's just, you know, as I said, a sketch, a draft, and so thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gonçalo. And the next presentation is by David Hernandez de la Fuente. So that David is here, so if it's possible, yes, you can see you. David, please.
Hello. Yes, first of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude for the invitation to this seminar. I'm very happy to be here. I will be presenting a paper, work in progress, but I wrote some pages on this issue with the title Modern Culture of Legality and the Classical World. In this contribution, I aim to delve into the classical roots of some of the current debates in political and legal philosophy on the culture of legality and the state of exception, recently revised in the wake of the recent pandemic of COVID-19. The paper has 4 parts. For reasons of time, I don't have 20 minutes. I will be focusing on the 2 latter parts of the paper. And I will be briefly summarizing the two first chapters, so to speak. And I will leave the discussion for the written version of this paper. My aim is to revise two cases. First, in the first case, the idea of constitutional patriotism or Verfassungspatriotismus, coined by Habermas, in comparison with the reforms of Clisthenes leading to Athenian democracy in 507 BC. Secondly, I have my intention is to review some notions and procedures of classical politics regarding the state of exception, and comparing it with the theory of current political philosophy from Carl Smith and Giorgio Agamben onwards. But this I will leave for the written version of the papers. And I will focus on the two other parts. Third, I will deal with the plague as a political metaphor in Greece and Rome, and with the legal approaches to this phenomenon and what we can learn from them. And fourth and last, my intention is to revise the ideas and means for the social control and surveillance in antiquity, both in theory and practice, with the excuse of the plague and the state of exception. My aim in this panorama is to reflect upon the classical sources of these current debates, as I say. So let me start with the third chapter, the plague as a political metaphor. I will be reading my text in order to be accurate with the time. An epidemic is a good metaphor by following the old body politic motif, that is the analogy between the state and the human body. The political disease can be civil discord, economic imbalance, or social unrest. The idea of political disease is an old matter, as old as democracy, as we see in the vocabulary borrowings from the Hippocratic medicine in the politics of democratic Athens: crisis, isonomia, equality, stasis or discord, etc. Plato already in the Republic, 556 compared the diseased body and the divided city, and in the Sophist, 228 illness and civil discord were considered to be equal. In this metaphor, it would be obvious to have the ruler compared to a good doctor, to a good physician, and sometimes his methods to heal the city's sick body have to be expeditious and involve the suppression of freedoms and the submission of citizens to new extraordinary measures and rules for the common good. That is, the limbs and organs of the body must obey the head without hesitation. The political physician, very fashionable today, hides an obvious danger. In a democracy like the one Karl Popper defended in The Open Society and Its Enemies, as opposed to the Platonic ideal of the wise authoritarian ruler healer, individual liberties are assumed to be at the center. And what happens when the plague is literal? Perhaps then it is time to decree a state of exception for reasons of public health that restricts freedoms. Epidemics, known quite well in classical Greece and Rome, cause devastation not only in terms of human lives, but also in the moral, political, and legal landscapes. Plato writes his political work, his challenge to Attic democracy, right after the Peloponnesian War, as well as the plague of the time ruined it. The decline of democracy is obviously not attributable only to the plague of 430 BC, but I think the relationship between plague and totalitarianism is most suggestive to rethink today. The metaphorical comparison of the plague with the end of freedom is certainly not new. Albert Camus' novel The Plague and the play State of Siege, written shortly after World War II and almost on a par with Popper's book, are highly pertinent allegories in this regard. As usual, everything started in Athens. And as in the recent coronavirus pandemic, the terrible epidemic that decimated the population in troubled times appeared. It never rained, but it pours in the case of Athens. There was a panic about conspiracies against democracy on the part of the Spartan enemy and his sympathizers in Athenian society, especially in certain intellectual elites who had never ceased to admire the political system of the rival city. Since the establishment of democracy, Athens had been subjected to major political ups and downs. For this reason, it needed to introduce various mechanisms to prevent tyranny and sedition. But it was not until the war and the plague that tensions rose, and they precipitated several coups or attempts to seize power. Indeed, the concern was such that at a law cited by orator Thucydides, 195, required every Athenian to swear to do everything possible to prevent the overthrow of democracy, including murder with impunity. The plague of 430 came at the worst possible moment and was handled badly by the authorities. Terror, suspicion, and socio-political violence spread. The famous description of Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War, book 2, remind us today to what extent we can study the events that have taken place in the past, and above all, how humans behave in such circumstances. So we can take some notes. Some of the pages that he dedicated to the plague of Athens suggest something like this. It is obvious that the most monstrous effects of the plague were not only the physical ones, that is the evident slaughter and cruelty with which the disease devastated the lives of so many citizens, but especially the moral and political decline of the city of Pericles, which anticipated a collapse that would make the Athenian democracy a fester of conspiracies, political intrigues, demagoguery, and coup, until its sad end, defeated in war and subjected to a puppet and tyrannical government. The epidemic, says Thucydides, was for the city the beginning of a greater disregard for the law, for people more easily dared to cover up when they did to satisfy their taste, since they saw that the change of fortune was sudden between the rich, who died suddenly, and the poor, who had nothing before and immediately owned the goods of those. In this way, they wanted to achieve the enjoyment of things quickly and with maximum pleasure, since they considered both wealth and life ephemeral. No respect for the gods or human law held them back. End of the quote. People gave in to hoaxes, were credulous in the face of superstition, and fell into disbelief regarding the functioning of their society and their political system. Visceral hatreds between social classes and between political factions, needless to say, also surfaced starkly. The story is well known, and it was only the beginning of the war, but it all started on the wrong foot for Athenian democracy, which after the plague would go from error to error until the final disaster. Was there a permanent state of exception caused by the terrifying experience of the plague? We do not know if this was the case, but the plague was indelibly etched in the collective psyche and certainly gave a sad and defeatist air to the once thriving democracy. As Luciano Canfora mentioned in his book, The World of Athens, the succession of attempted oligarchic or reactionary coup during the war and after the plague can be proved as an effect of the course of the war. A tragedy like Sophocles' Philoctetes, which is precisely about a plagued hero subjected to a cruel confinement on the island of Lemnos, and who turns out to be a key figure, according to an oracle, for the Greeks to win the Trojan War, surely represents the tension of the Athenian polis after the oligarchic coup d'etat of 411 in the struggle for terms such as democracy, freedom, or equality. The plague, in any case, became a political metaphor throughout antiquity from the decline of Athens. Its repercussions are especially present in Latin literature, from which the subject has passed into modernity. A recent book by Hunter Gardner, entitled Pestilence and the Body Politic in Latin Literature, has explored the importance of the narrative of the plague in Rome, with special attention to another historical moment as exceptional as the Peloponnesian War, and so fundamental to later political consciousness as the former. The complex transition between the Roman Republic and the Roman rule of Augustus, between the time of Caesar and that of Augustus. In a convulsive and unforgettable moment like this, it is not surprising that the theme of the plague becomes a key issue. The bond of union is the episode of the plague of Athens, as Lucretius refers to it in his poem, De Rerum Natura. The narrative of the epidemic as a symbol of the dissolution of the body politic will appear in Cicero in the midst of the late Republican socio-political conflict, and endured in the two authors crucial to Augustus's reform program, Virgil in his three poetic works, and Titus Livius in A Urbe Condita. It is the state of exception that brings the figure of the providential man, like Augustus himself, who stands as a healer, a providential healer of the moral and political epidemic. Civil wars, compared to a bloody plague inside the body of Rome, are cured thanks to the cauterization of the exceptional sovereign, an epic physician. In his book, Gardner also examined the presence of the plague in other later authors, such as Lucan or Seneca, and dwells on the relevance of this political metaphor for later literature, especially medieval historiography. Biopolitics, to use Foucauldian terminology, are much older in short than the coronavirus crisis and the plague narrative. In any case, it is related to the classical world, to this scenario of final crisis of the most remembered political systems of antiquity, the Athenian democracy and the Roman republics. Nevertheless, it is an important narrative used as an excuse to impose social control and a state of emergency. And here we go to our second and final topic. When in 1975, Michel Foucault published his now classic book, Sur de Punir, an exemplary study of the tools of the state's social control based on the death throes of the Ancien Regime, he devoted essential pages in the famous chapter on the Panopticon to the measures taken in Vincennes after the advent of the plague, using a health regulation written in the late 18th century. Compared to earlier times, from antiquity to the Middle Ages, when only the infected were isolated, the defining feature of the modern age is the dream of absolute control enacted by the authorities, who subject the rest of the population to strict rules and regulate their mobility and their habits. As Foucault says, the plagued city, traversed by hierarchy, surveillance, immobilized, is the utopia of the perfectly governed city. It is absolute control in a state of exception. It is total sovereignty. Another important book in this sense is that of the above mentioned Agamben. His Homo Sacer 2.1 sees the paradoxical need to establish a theory of how it arises from the vacuum of rights and freedoms in what he considers as the essential contiguity between a state of exception and sovereignty, according to Carl Schmitt's classical definition of sovereign. Power and control, with the excuse of exceptionality, go hand in hand, from Plato and Thucydides to Cicero to Foucault and Agamben. The diseased body of the state is the perfect excuse, the perfect metaphor for the interventions of the political doctor, so to speak. In short, we don't know in detail the special laws enacted during the Athenian or the Roman crisis, but the state of exception has traditionally been related to epidemics and wars. Legally, as it is well known, the concept appeared for the first time in the legislation of the Revolutionary Fronts, l'état de siège, as the well-known theorist Schmitt points out. But it is possible to find some precedents of classical states of exceptions in suspension of individual rights, atinia or ostracism in Athens, and also in exceptional magistrates' power in Rome, as for example in the procedure of dictatorship, dictatura. Let's go to the final part of the paper. Going back to Foucault's Chevalier Punir, the definition of the modern age control for the French philosopher, as we just said in his emblematic book on social control, is seen in episodes like this, with the already mentioned difference between ancient and medieval confinement and modern restrictions. No? And it is precisely the emphasis on the continuous surveillance of the individual by the state that is also in question today, and that, in my view, marks the modern approach to this question. when the health authorities proposed physical, geographical, clinical control over the population, even through mobile phones. Who has been infected, who is in contact with whom, and who is in each place in that time, if they are where they should be or not, all for the sake, naturally, of public health, but taking an exponential leap in the modern obsession with the surveillance and disciplining of individuals. It is not unusual to place the 18th century, in the 18th century, the beginning of the new obsession of the state with the control of society over the ruins of the old regime, of the ancien regime. It is usually argued that the key thinker was the Englishman Jeremy Bentham, who revolutionized political and legal philosophy in his time and tried to implement this idea of panopticon, a failed idea. But it illustrates very well the origin of this modern social control. Although it was never built, the panopticon was enormously influential, as Foucault predicted a paradigm of later disciplinary institutions, and even today. It was conceived as a structure of concentric circles with a central watchtower and a lightning system through the cells. Under these conditions, it was not only necessary to place one guard, it was only necessary to place one guard in the central tower and then lock up a condemned person, an inmate, or a sick patient in each cell to have them totally under control. The dream of the philosopher Bentham was also the dream of previous Greek and Roman politicians. We can look for some precedents of these ideas of social control and espionage in different Greek cities and urbanistic projects. This is seen above all in Plato's political projects, sometimes considered utopian, some other just totalitarian. The architectural plan of his utopian cities sometimes looked a lot like a panopticon, like Atlantis in Critias 113c to d, a city built in concentric circles with an island in the middle. But without any doubt, it was in the city described in the Laws, the last dialogue of the philosophers of Athens, where the total control of the population is most overwhelming. Here, the guardians watched over all the citizens, Laws 959b, and a night council, which met secretly, was invisible for the president, 961b, took steps to comply with its ruthless laws. Surely Bentham owes much to Plato and to the Greek word. The very name panopticon refers to the legendary giant Argos Panoptes, who sees everything with 100 eyes, which Velázquez painted before the giant's death at the hands of Hermes. And there is little more panopticon than Olympus itself, the idea of the Greek divinities watching and controlling over humanity and punishing their pride from times to times. This quasi-divine inspection of the state must work without stopping and feed back on the fear of the citizen. When speaking of social control, Foucault showed how the plague could be used as a great excuse to give the state free rein, with exceptional full powers over a military and a medical corps that prevents disorder, looting, and contagion. But if in the 18th century it was necessary to send inspectors to each tenement to inquire about their health status and verify that they were still confined, today a police or health app on the mobile phone would suffice. But now, as before, terrified citizens would betray their neighbors who do not comply with the regulation, as it happens often in Spain. Foucault concludes the plague, at least that which is kept in the state of prevention, is a test in which the exercise of disciplinary power can ideally be defined. To make rights and laws work according to pure theory, jurists imagine themselves in a state of nature. To see their perfect discipline work, rulers dreamed of the plague states. As already seen, these two case studies we have presented, the other two we have no time for discussion, and we will leave it for a written version of this paper, have been mentioned here to point the classical roots of the discussions surrounding the current crisis of the political community, the constitutional mechanism to control it, and the state of exception with the occasion of the recent COVID crisis. taken this brief tour on of the aspects of the history of political ideas in the classical world in key authors such as Thucydides, Plato, Cicero, that may have the most relevance for our current world in times of a post-pandemic crisis, we realize that much of the debate on the culture of legality in our current democracies still depend on some question and issues raised in antiquity, in ancient politics. To conclude, these two great participatory regimes of ancient history, antique democracy and the Roman Republic, which have been paradigmatic for Western democracies since their bourgeois refounding at the end of the Enlightenment, continue to provide models for very fruitful discussion around aspects that have been recently updated. Thus, both the idea of overcoming ethnic, religious, or tribal divisions in pursuit of a cohesive community, in the case of constitutional patriotism, of Clisthenes, from Clisthenes to Habermas, as well as the mechanism, the exceptional mechanism during moments of crisis and transformation in the historical processes of Greece and Rome, can be taken into consideration for a fruitful modern discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David. And the last presentation for today is by Lydia, the Tienda Palop, about trust and deception on an interesting example of contemporary army forces. Lydia, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Nuria and the colleagues in Belgrade for this invitation to participate in the workshop. I have to say that I must apologize because maybe in the debate I have to leave soon because I have class quite soon, but maybe I can make it, but if I have to leave, I have to say it before that. Okay, my presentation will face one problem that arises in contemporary management of humanitarian crises, in armed conflicts in particular. Today, the internationally legitimate missions of the armed force are part of the so-called peace operations. These missions, which very roughly can be of three types: peace building, peacemaking, and peacekeeping. There is a more specific categorization of these operations determined by UN in 1992, but these three clusters are all encompassing. So I'm not going to go into a deep knowledge or deep presentation of this. As I'm saying, these peace operations have meant that the contemporary army institution has been reconceptualized, and it has to attend to crisis management through methods and actions in accordance with international law. It is this confluence between international charters of rights, human rights, moral foundations, and the proper rationale of the institution that pose a few paradoxes, which make it difficult to justify some strategies and methods in the current institution of the armed force of a democratic state. On the one hand, a democratic state sometimes has to face the toughest experience in humanitarian terms that exist, that is the war. And for this, the methods used sometimes exceed in some way the human moral framework given by respect for life and other values. And also, on the other hand, the ways of conducting and intervening in an armed conflict are legally limited by international treaties and the humanitarian law itself. In this presentation, I intend to address one specific point of this dilemma in the contemporary international framework and analyze in more detail the specific capability for civil-military cooperation, which in its current version presents more clearly the paradox of the moral dilemma between trust and deception. Today, humanitarian crises caused by armed conflicts are understood as complex emergencies. Complex emergencies are those which causes are due to a multitude of factors of different kinds: cultural, economic, religious, political, and even environmental or health issues intervene. The confluence of the different heterogeneous dimensions that leads us to a crisis entails the circumstance that crisis management has evolved in recent years. The concept of international security has become elastic, and nowadays it is understood in a multidimensional way, following the wake of other notions such as human development, developed by Amartya Sen, or the concept of poverty itself by Sabina Al-Khair, which are also understood in a multidimensional way. Since 1990, a new concept of human development has been used by the UNPD, inaugurated by the emergence of a new perspective, the capabilities approach. This event has caused an expansion of the theoretical framework from which analyze human reality. Its ultimate objectives and moral character deeply influence the conceptualization and shaping of the public policies that underpin the global project to follow in order to pursue the human moral ends. The concept of international security has also been influenced by this new global ethical political paradigm, and the management of crises can no longer consist only in the deployment of a military force over the territory in conflict to stabilize the area through the use of violence. On the contrary, we begin to see clearly that it is necessary to act on the roots that have triggered the crisis: structural poverty, ethnic, cultural, or religious classes, endemic radical inequalities, lack of political freedom, the lack of access to basic goods such as education or health, for instance. All these factors, together with the evidence of geopolitical interest and therefore the intervention of alien sovereignties in the conflict itself, supporting some of the sides at odds by particular interests, are at the bottom of the conflicts. Then, if we focus on this first level of a certain concept of multidimensional security, as mentioned, closely linked to that of human development, also mentioned, I would like to highlight one circumstance. Nowadays, in crisis management, not only military agents intervene, but civilian agents are also essential for crisis management. What do I understand by civilian agents? With civil agents, I refer mainly to the international agencies that today are characterized for carrying out humanitarian work. These are both international organizations and NGOs. I'm referring to Doctors Without Borders, the International Red Cross and Crescent, Oxfam, Save the Children, or even the UNPD itself, or other organizations that operate in areas where, on multiple occasions, the conditions of insecurity and violence are such that it is difficult for them to work, endangering the lives of aid workers and even preventing that any kind of humanitarian activity can be developed or provided. Clear examples known by all of us are those of the coast of Somalia, ravaged by piracy, in which without a minimum security and patrol conditions in the area, it is impossible to send any convoy of humanitarian aid to its destination. Also, we have to mention the recent events in Afghanistan with many particularities that has led to some cooperation between the army and some humanitarian organizations in the evacuation of refugees that precisely cooperate with the army. Therefore, in principle, it seems that in current armed conflict and humanitarian crisis, it is necessary to articulate some kind of cooperation between the civil agents and the army. But this interaction poses multiple ethical dilemmas that need to be considered. Before presenting the nature of one of these ethical dilemmas, because I'm going to focus just on one of them that is related to these trust and deception methods used by armies today, that is the basis what I have mentioned, this ethical problem. We should clarify the basics of the concept of civil-military cooperation that is being used by NATO, the European Union, and the UN. Civil-military cooperation has a historical evolution. It arises from a concept that emerged mainly from the experience of the Vietnam War. It emerged as a concept to win the heart and the mind of the population. That is, as another tool of war to support the success of the mission, noting that the war was lost precisely because of the violent interaction approach to the Vietnamese population by the US Army. Very briefly summarizing, while it is true that at first the expression CIMIC, civil military cooperation, that is a capability of NATO mainly, was conceived as a capability of high strategic value to achieve the heart and the mind of the population, and in this way facilitate the success of the mission. Nowadays, there is a trend to seek legitimacy in actions that are more civilian than military in nature. This means conceiving CIMIC more broadly and the specific capability of armies to coordinate with the civilian agents on the ground, and thus to combine efforts in solving the crisis in a more efficient and humanitarian way, avoiding duplication or impairments that add an extra difficulty due to the lack of coordination or lack of understanding. NATO distinguishes between two notions: civil-military interaction, CMI, and CIMIC, civil-military cooperation. Civil-military interaction would be a group of activities founded on communication, planning, and coordination that all NATO military bodies share and conduct with international and local non-military actors, both during NATO operations and in preparation of them, which mutually increases the effectiveness and efficiency of their respective actions in response to crisis. And civil-military cooperation, CIMIC, this refers to a joint function comprising a set of integral capabilities to support the achievement of mission objectives and enabling NATO commands to effectively participate in a broad spectrum of civil-military interaction activities with diverse non-military actors. Then, while CMI, civil-military interaction, would be properly all the interactions in which military and civilians intervene, CIMIC, civil-military cooperation, is a specific capability of the Army, among others, to achieve the success of mission. Then, the NATO CIMIC concept consists of three core activities. It's based on these three core activities: liaison, support to the force, support to the civil environment. Civil-military liaison, the first one, entails the identification of civil actors and development of a liaison structure. This function comprises a set of activities in order to create and develop a set of links, contacts, and connections with local agents, local authorities, or civilian also, that may have a role in the area and therefore can contribute to facilitate the mission. This liaison structure has to be maintained in time, and it is based on trust. The trust is the most important thing to keep in this activity. And what is the case? And the second one is support to the force, which entails identify key civil indicators, promote acceptance between the population, facilitate access to the resources to the troops, includes activities to facilitate the development of the mission, and it can be since facilitate the access to accommodation, water, or to manage licenses to comply with the country legality, but also to win the heart and mind of population, to avoid or minimize the conflict or the impact of the deployment of alien forces, but also to identify crucial dimensions that can be a problem of the mission or the troops, such as an epidemic, a lack of energy, an ethnic conflict, for example. And the third key or core activity is support to civil actors and their environment, which entails support to capacity building, sharing information, support by military means only as the first option, but sometimes it can be used, this military means to help. This support to civil actors is the function could pose an ethical issue. These activities can interfere with the job of the humanitarian agencies, which is the frontier between the humanitarian aid properly and the aid provided by the army to the population, which ultimately is also humanitarian aid. This would be one of the ethical dilemmas. But what is the case for this presentation, this thing between trust and deception, is that all these activities are based on trust, only sometimes between the military and the civilian. And then here is where we start to find the specific dilemma that I want to address. We find within military operations different types of capabilities and activities that are conducted, in many of which the use of force is carried out. But there is a set of activities in which physically violent methods are not necessarily used, but some kind of morally questionable activity is used within the so-called InfoOps operations, information operations. These activities are aimed at neutralizing the enemy, using methods such as propaganda, undermining the adversary's self-esteem, or even cognitively manipulating the adversary. These activities are often deployed in the same area where CIMIC teams are operating also, and we start to see the problem, with which we already find the paradox. These InfoOps, sometimes focus on techniques that can include deception. Also is quite key method to use. But the strong and key point of CIMIC operation, as we have mentioned, is to create a network trustworthy, because it is the way to improve conflict management cooperating with civilians. Then what is happening? The same army has two teams working in the same area, one working with deception, the other with trust. So it seems a little schizophrenic, or even it could have a bad impact in both missions, no? Somehow. I think that in order to answer this dilemma, we should go back to the beginning of the presentation and remember the notion of human security as we have developed, that we used at the beginning, if you remember. We said that human security today must be understood in a multidimensional way, emphasizing that there are multiple factors involved: cultural, social, religious, economic, and so on. And therefore, the notion of the enemy itself has also changed. Today, talking about a specific enemy is meaningless, because the enemies embodied in particular people are in turn produced by the system that generates these structural inequalities and endemic injustice conditions. Therefore, if we want to generate models that contribute to improving human security, globally understood, it is necessary to change our point of view and understand that military methodologies based on techniques such as deception can have a short-term impact, but they are not sustainable in time, but rather have to evolve towards methodologies similar to the objectives of those other CIMIC activities that are based on transparency, trust, and which methods incorporate the ethical perspective, not only in their objectives, but also in their procedures. So I pose the question, the dilemma that today has to face mainly NATO. And also, I think that the solution is to think somehow different this concept of human security as a concept that involves the planet to all together. So that was the main thesis. So we can, I'm working even in advising on these issues to the Spanish military the Spanish army to this issue, how to articulate both perspectives. So I can answer any question if you have in these issues. Thank you very much. And that would be.
Thank you, Lydia. And also, again, thanks, Gonzalo and David. We had very nice presentation. And now I will open the floor for the discussion. Please use raise hand option if you have any questions. Nuria, please.
Thank you, Igor. Thank you to all of you. I think it was a very inspiring, very rich panel. And I would like to concentrate perhaps in the first and the third presentation. I would like also to make some comment to share some remark with David. Perhaps I make it at the end of my intervention. I will begin with Gonzalo's presentation. I'm also quite interested in this survey you are endeavoring of the ideological patterns functioning in contemporary societies. And I would like to focus especially in the last point, the last part of your presentation, where you had to go a little faster because the time was short. I saw many common points between your research, and I wish you the best luck with the ERC proposal you are preparing, with, for example, the work of Wendy Brown, States of Injury, Brown's analysis of resentment, of the history of resentment, but also the high increase of this emotional value in contemporary societies. And also I saw these common points with Zeynep Gambetti's papers regarding the power of alt-right movements to spread their positions, their standpoints in societies as the North American society, but also European societies, as German, French democracies, where alt-right populism is also embodied by concrete powers. And so I see in your research a very inspiring survey of emotions of as resentment, as distrust. How is distrust based in concrete map of emotions? But I see your research is very close to a point you tackle at the beginning of the presentation, and that is the hermeneutical injustice, analyzed by Fricker in her well-known essay. Fricker devotes very short pages of this essay to the phenomenon of hermeneutical injustice. I would like to ask you whether you consider that, for example, emotions as resentment against the other, the stranger, the foreigner, because she is provoking, for example, my disemployment status, my status as an employed person in my society. So I consider that my own problems, my own sources of social suffering are related with the existence of other. This resentment and the opposite phenomenon of epistocracy, what you mentioned as epistocracy at the beginning of the presentation, both phenomena, they show a kind of epistemic distortion, which hermeneutics could help to break down, to dissect and to cast light over what is working badly there. And so I would like to ask you about how would you engage with this opposition of phenomena that at the end are also related because they both are or appear as epistemic pathologies. I would like also to ask Lydia about this very, very new for me, but very inspiring presentation of all the stages, all the entangled field related with civil military cooperation and interaction. I didn't know, I had no idea about this, both sides of the same itinerary, so to say. And I would like to concentrate in civil military interaction, especially to confirm that I grasped well your presentation. I understood this civil military interaction as a first step required to go further with a civil military cooperation. That is, a civil military cooperation with a missing dialogue, interaction between the two parts would fail. Would surely fail in its strategy, in achieving its goals. But taking this as something meeting this civil military framework, I wonder if this interaction has sound tenets or a clear way of decision making in order to prioritize, for example, between the demands and the claims that in this dialogue and interaction, the civil groups, the native groups, where these military forces are based, are established, raise to these military authorities. I don't know if I make me understand. I would like to know whether military forces, military intelligence strategy dealt, and I think surely they did it, or they will have some suggestions with this issue of prioritize. Because when you speak, or when you use this term, this verb, prioritize, you are also using a hermeneutical framework, because perhaps what is prioritary for you is not prioritary for me, or for my culture, for my cultural background. And I think this should be a source of many challenges and problems. And I would like to know something more about that. And to David, I just would like to thank you. His presentation, it was as always very illuminating, and I just would like to ask him, or to try to make him further analyze this issue, the following issue. When we speak of institutional trust in the past, we are also usually forced to deal with the fact that some emotions, perhaps emotions as a whole, they are a historical phenomenon, and I would like to ask you how do you think a cultural history of trust should be addressed, taking as a reference the history of classicism, or perhaps Greek classicism, but also late antiquity, where the institutional forms ruin and decay. Thank you to the three.
Given that Nuria put many questions, it's probably better that you first answer, and then we see if there are more questions.
I was wondering if I can start, because unfortunately I must leave in some minutes because of another commitment. Do you mind?
Okay, sorry.
Thank you, Nuria, for your question. It's very, very interesting. I work lately on the notion of ethos in the status of the orator, of the public speaker, in the both in the Roman Republic and in the classical Attic democracy. And this would be the idea of creating, through empathic image of an orator, the trust, or establishing a trust between the mass of the assembly and the figure of the speaker, as Cicero would put it, vir bonus dicendi peritus. Like, the public speaker must appear to be good and to be a trustworthy man. And I think that this is the part of the ethos of the first part of the public discourse, no? Opposed to the pathos in the last part, which try to arise emotions such as fear, anger, compassion. But I would put it like this: I would say that the ethos is the opening scenario of the public speaking, both in Rome, in the Forum, or in the Athenian Assembly. No? It's a question I'm working on, and it's a good suggestion to add to my panorama, because I had a part on trust, not only on distrust, no? But I chose to focus on the last part because of time. So I will surely be adding this consideration to my work. Thanks a lot.
Probably Gonzalo.
So
I think Lydia is in a hurry. So please, Lydia, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have time, but maybe I'm a little bit because because of the class. So thank you, Nuria, for the question, because as always is really clever, and you see the crucial and the key thing. Because I was not going to address that question in this paper, so I lead it to this notion between, or this paradox between trust and deception. But what is behind has to deal with what you have pointed out. This idea of prioritize the objectives. Sorry about my English today, but it's like years I don't speak English, so today I don't feel any fluent. So sorry about that. So the thing, if I can answer the question quite brief, although it's quite long to answer, is that civil-military interaction are all these activities when the army and the civilians intervene. But it's not a specific capability of the army. So it's not a combat capability as civil military cooperation, that it is a capability for combat. That's the point. The other is like the army can engage with the media or can go to some place with civilians, any activity, but it does not have any purpose for military issues. But civil military cooperations, it does. It has a specific military objective or purpose. So then, what is happening? That I emphasize these three activities because civil military cooperation, although they use humanitarian aid or they provide humanitarian aid, the purpose is not to provide humanitarian aid. The purpose is for combat. So it's a capability to support the mission. So then it comes this thing with prioritizing, because the objectives are not the same as the civilians. So for civilians, for population, they have one objective, but the army and the mission can have other purpose completely different. Then we find this paradox that these activities that are not help, that are not humanitarian assistance, could be only a cosmetic activity. So that's the point. And then we find this paradox between, so they go with guns and also with muffins. So what is happening here? It's only a cosmetic activity, and then it could be somehow it could have an impact of losing this trust that they want to earn. So that's the point. But then, if we that would be my answer to the question of prioritizing. But then I start the paper exposing that legitimate operations are those called peace operations. So somehow there is a political will behind that. So the political, it depends somehow of the political will, not on the army that is just an institution of a political institution. So or of the government. So the thing is that this political will is the one that sends this operation. So somehow in this way we can somehow link what is the interest of population and the interest of the state that represent the population. So we can solve this paradox. So military cooperation does not prioritize in principle the population objectives, but in the end, the ultimate objective of the mission has to be according to the political will. So somehow, I don't know if this way I answer your question. That would be the way to. So, sorry, my English.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nuria, for your very generous and excellent comment. You really understood what I am doing, and I basically agree with you. But here's what I can say in response. So, and thank you also for the references. I am not very well acquainted with them. I've seen a little bit of what Wendy Brown says, but I shall look further into it, and I'll have to ask you for the second reference because I couldn't catch the name, but we can speak later on. So first off, on the spread of these ideologies and of alt-right or right-wing populist ideologies, much has already been done and can be done at an empirical level. I mean, we all know more or less how this proceeds. We can speak of the Nationalist International, let's say, that was once led by Steve Bannon, and we all know how the fake news and the popular myths among the alt-right and QAnon are born. For instance, the Soros boogeyman story, etc. It has to do, on the one hand, with the fake news that are produced and planted and disseminated with very specific targets, etc. And so this is something, and also with the very specific nature of social media. We all know this, the digital bubbles, the way in which hate speech creates more buzz online on social media than other type of content or information, etc. And so this is another aspect that I didn't go into, but which must be taken into account. And then in my presentation itself, and I am sorry that my conclusion was a bit hasty because of the lack of time, I didn't really go into the issues of hermeneutic. And I just very briefly went into the issues of hermeneutic and justice or emotions, basically because I felt that speaking about epistemic injustice and speaking specifically about trust, this was more closely linked with testimonial injustice rather than hermeneutic injustice. And so the examples I gave of intersubjective trust were more dealing with lack of trust or mistrust of people who give their word on something. And so this is according to Fricker's terminology, not hermeneutic injustice, but epistemic injustice. But you're right that hermeneutic injustice is very important in this context, because hermeneutic injustice has to do with what Fricker calls a lack or a gap in the collective hermeneutic resource. And so the state of advancement, let's say, of a society's, let's say, normative orders, symbolic structure, etc. And what happens when these ideologies are very widespread is that phenomena of epistemic injustice or other types of injustice are just blatantly hidden, let's say. And so this is something that must be confronted. I also ended up not speaking very much about emotions, but you pinpointed the issue very well, because actually, even when I am speaking of rationality, my view of rationality integrates within it the not only the cognitive, but the emotional aspects too. I have, Antonio Damasio and Kahneman, etc., in mind when I am thinking about the ways in which we perceive others, etc. And this is where all the discussions on bias and the negative emotions, etc., enter. And so, to try to answer your question, I found it very suggestive to compare all the negative emotions, all the bias, the xenophobia, etc., and epistocracy, both as let's say issues of epistemic pathologies or something like that, which is usually not the way in which people treat epistocracy, because actually they might be, but I think you are right, it's also an epistemic pathology, let's say, epistocracy, but they are actually quite the opposite. Because if one, and xenophobia and racism, etc., are usually treated in contemporary virtue epistemology as epistemic vices, and there's a very, as you certainly know, there's a big bibliography on that. But long story short, usually these epistemic vices of these sorts of emotions, resentment, etc., are usually associated with ignorance. People who act badly, let's say, out of these emotions are treated as ignorant, and so sometimes their responsibility is even a bit mitigated, because it has to do with lack of access to education and stuff like that. Whereas epistocratic solutions tend to present themselves precisely as an alternative, for instance, to democratic ways of solving the problems. For instance, when they speak about the ethics of voting, what they say is, oh, look, if we give the right of vote to everyone, what we have is right-wing populism and this undesirable outcome. And so let's limit access only to people who have a certain degree of epistemic qualities, let's say. And so let's leave decision making not to every democratic citizen, but only to people who know, let's say. And I would say this is pathological, but this is not usually the way in which this issue is treated. I mean, ultimately, I think that what we really have to do is, on the one hand, when dealing with these issues, to avoid paternalism. That's what I tried to say at the end of my talk, and also basically just to understand in a deep manner, and that's the reason why I talked about the hermeneutic methodology applied to this, the real causes fueling the discontentment. For instance, the economic causes that fuel right-wing populism, etc. And with this, really understand how these people are being tricked, why they are being tricked, and what we can do to really solve the problems that are fueling these pathological lies, etc. Sorry, this was long.
Thank you. We have one question from Andrea Perunovic. And sorry, Clara, you raised hand in some moment. Do you have a question? Probably we could keep. Okay, first Andrea and then Clara, and we have a bit less than 10 minutes.
So yeah, I want to thank everyone.
Sorry. I have to leave. I'm very sorry, but I have to leave now. So thank you.
Okay, bye. Thank you, Lydia.
So thanks to everyone for a great panel. I just have one question, or rather a remark for Gonçalo. I very much liked the concept of hermeneutical delusion, and I would like just maybe to add maybe a reading from a different perspective to it. Something that could be related to it. It's a term from psychoanalytic tradition. It's Freud's term, which is called the fetishist disavowal. If you want, that's a phenomenon when we say, okay, I know that the thing in which I believe is false, but still I keep on believing in it, and I don't mind if I know it is false. So maybe this other perspective on the I think you might correct me if I'm wrong, on the same phenomenon, maybe it could enrich your reading of that phenomenon. That's one thing. And then maybe on the question of rationality, I don't know. I kept on thinking about Sartre's conception of consciousness, which is consciousness of belief, conscience de croyance. He merely puts a sign of equality between consciousness and belief. So I don't know if we can speak about how from the hermeneutical point of view, that's my question actually, how from the hermeneutical point of view you have differentiate the trust and mistrust. Do the hermeneutics see those as two same phenomenons, or is certitude and suspicion in the end of the day very different stuff, or are we speaking about same phenomenon, just with some kind of let's say negative mistrust is the negative side of trust or something like that? So sorry, I will not go anymore. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, now Clara, if you can.
I've already written in on the chat. My question was for Lydia, so if you want to pose another question, just feel free.
So Gonçalo.
Okay, so thank you very much, Andrea. It's a perfect comment too. Yes, I think the concept of fetishist disavowal is very important. I shall have to. It's a great suggestion. I shall have to look more closely into it. But so I believe something is false, but I cling to it. Yes, I think the question we might pose in terms of the hermeneutical delusion is the following. Probably there are cases in which I don't really know that the belief is false. And in those cases, I think we can really speak of ideological blindness. That is, the ideological blindness is the effect of the hermeneutical delusion. And in cases which we are really captured by the core ideological belief around which all the other beliefs exist, let's say, I would say that one clings to the ideological belief sometimes merely out of effective reasons, or maybe not merely out of effective reasons, but these are also tied to identity claims. That is, when one is really captured by an ideology, that ideology comes to define one's position in the world. So both in terms of political and moral orientation, one comes to be defined as, I don't know, a right-wing libertarian or whatever. And if within that specific ideology, one comes to see the world and oneself, including the moral world, as that right-wing libertarian that comes to believe this and that, it is not easy to transition out of that ideology. And so we might refuse, we might resist to revise the belief or the conviction, the political conviction, etc., because it is intrinsically tied to the way in which we have become accustomed to perceive the world and ourselves. It's a little bit like, the experience of conversion. I think in the terms of, Augustine and the experience of religious conversion, which is very difficult. And if you want a more down-to-earth political example, think of American History X, the end of American History X, when the little brother is killed, and then the other skinhead, the brother, he basically just relinquishes his old beliefs. But this is very difficult to do because there's a whole history of identity claims and education that it has become so ingrained as to make it very difficult to abandon this political ideology. But in other cases, probably the fetishist disavowal applies. That is, when people really recognize that something is false, but they just really don't care. I would say that this entails some sort of radical perspectivism. That is, for me, this is true. And so the hell with it, you bloody progressives. I don't know, something like this. So concerning the specific question, so how would the hermeneutical viewpoint differentiate between trust and mistrust? I can answer what the author in which I'm taking inspiration from would answer. That is how Ricoeur would answer this. So in two different books, he speaks about, in a book about Freud, precisely about Freud from 1965, he talks about the dialectics between suspicion and a restorative hermeneutics, or hermeneutics as a recollection of meaning. And then in 1990, yes, in Oneself as Another, it talks about the dialectics between attestation and suspicion. So what is at stake? They are qualitatively different insofar as, let's say, trusts, or what he calls attestation, which is basically, this is a formulation of Heidegger's Bezeugung, I think. He is defining what he calls the capable human being. And so he's making an inquiry into, let's say, ourselves and our human capacities. And he is asking things as, am I capable of reaching consciousness? Am I capable of speaking, of acting, etc.? And he basically says that trust is more fundamental than suspicion, but that in order for us to be certain of our capacities, we have to go through the test of, let's say, suspicion. And so, for instance, in the book about Freud, he speaks about the philosophies of suspicion in the context of a critical debate on the paradigm of consciousness. And so he says, contra Descartes, etc., we do not have an immediate access to our own consciousness. Access has to be mediated and has to, let's say, grapple with the objections of Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, etc., about false consciousness. And so, to sum up this this response very quickly, I would guess that for our own purposes, we can say that a basic attitude of trust towards others and the development of positive emotions or feelings towards oneself, such as the relations of recognition, respect, etc., are actually more fundamental than suspicion. And they are what forms the social bond, the trust in language, as I spoke at the beginning of my talk. However, it is evident that a certain exercise of suspicion, of mistrust, is actually tied to the exercise of critique too, which is a fundamental exercise for philosophy and social theory and critical theory, etc. And so that when we have when we have justified reasons for suspicion and mistrust, for instance, when institutions are becoming reified, etc., or unjust, etc., it should be something which we resort to, but always as some sort of secondary operation vis-a-vis what is probably a more fundamental operation of trust, which we need to in order to live with one another and trust the world, etc. I don't know if I really responded, but yeah, thank
you. Thank you, Gonzalo, and I want to thank you all today's panelists and participants in the discussion and those who listened. And I want to invite you all to join us tomorrow. We are starting tomorrow at 9:30. So see you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Bye. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.